If someone ever asks you that question, it means they've already decided what comes next. The rain started before my shift and never stopped, tapping against the restaurant windows like it had something to prove, and I stood behind the bar polishing the same glass for too long because it gave my hands something to do, something steady, something that didn't tremble the way I felt inside. My name is Ava Carter, 24, nursing student by day, waitress by night, and professional at pretending everything is fine, especially when it isn't. I checked my reflection in the mirror, behind the liquor shelf, tilting my wrist just enough to make sure the sleeve stayed in place. 3 inches of fabric between the world and the truth. Foundation layered carefully where it mattered. A practiced routine, nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone would notice unless they were really looking. And no one ever really looked. The dinner rush hit around 7. Same as always. Voices blending into a low hum. Silverware clinking. Expensive laughter echoing under warm lighting that made everything feel softer than it really was. And I moved through it like I belonged there. Like I wasn't counting steps. Like I wasn't bracing every time someone reached too fast or spoke too loud. Table 12. Marco called from the kitchen, already irritated, already stressed, and I grabbed a tray without thinking, slipping into that version of myself that smiled on cue and nodded at the right moments. The version that didn't flinch. That's when the room shifted, subtle at first, like the air. Changed direction. Conversations lowering without anyone being told to. A ripple moving across the space that made people straighten without knowing why. And I felt it before I saw him. That quiet kind of gravity that pulls everything toward it. Sebastian Hale walked in like he didn't need to announce himself. Like the world had already agreed to make space. Dark suit. Clean lines. Nothing flashy. But everything about him was deliberate. Controlled. And the men with him didn't speak either. They just followed, like orbiting something heavier than themselves. I kept my eyes down, because that's what you do. You don't stare at power, you don't invite attention you can't handle, but I felt it anyway. That sense of being seen from across the room, like a spotlight without light, like someone had decided I was worth noticing. And I hated how aware it made me, how my hands tightened around the tray just a little more. I approached the table, reciting the specials like I had 100 times before, voice steady, posture perfect, every movement calculated to be forgettable. Because forgettable is safe. Forgettable doesn't get you into trouble. And for a second, I thought it worked. Thought I could get through another night without anything breaking. Then it happened. Small, stupid, the kind of thing that shouldn't matter. The edge of my sleeve catching on a glass. The tray tilting just enough. My balance shifting. And suddenly his hand was there, catching my wrist before the glass could fall. Before I could stumble. Before anyone else even noticed. Everything slowed. Like the sound dropped out of the room, like the world held its breath, and I felt the warmth of his grip, firm but careful, nothing like the kind of touch I was used to bracing against. And that difference hit me harder than anything else. My sleeve slid back, just an inch, maybe less, but enough for the truth to show, enough for the marks I worked so hard to hide to sit there under the soft restaurant lights like they belonged to someone else, someone weaker, someone I didn't want to be. I pulled back instinctively. Too late, already seen, already exposed, and for a split second I considered laughing it off, making a joke, pretending it was nothing, because that's what I always did. That's how you survive, you minimize. You deflect, you move on. But he didn't move on. He didn't look away. His eyes dropped to my wrist and stayed there, not curious, not confused, just focused, like he was reading something written beneath my skin. Careful, I said quickly, forcing a smile. Trying to reclaim the moment, trying to put everything back where it belonged. I'm fine. The words automatic, rehearsed, safe. His grip didn't tighten, didn't hurt, but it didn't disappear either, just enough to keep me there, just enough. To make it clear that this moment wasn't over yet. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, even, like he wasn't asking for information so much as confirming something he already knew. Who did this to you? The question landed heavier than it should have. Simple words, but they cut through everything, through the noise, through the routine, through every excuse I'd built over the past 6 months, and for a second I forgot how to breathe. I laughed, too quickly, too light, the kind of sound that doesn't convince anyone. It's nothing, I said, pulling my sleeve down, covering what didn't want to be covered anymore. I'm just clumsy. The lie familiar, worn smooth from overuse. His eyes lifted from my wrist to my face, and that was worse, because he saw it. All of it. The hesitation, the fear, the practiced calm, and he didn't argue, didn't push, didn't call me out, which somehow made it feel more serious, more final. Doors can be dangerous, he said after a moment. The words neutral. But something underneath them shifted, something quiet and cold and certain, like a decision had already been made somewhere I couldn't see. He let go of my wrist then, just like that. No drama, no warning, and the world rushed back in, sound returning, movement resuming. The restaurant continuing like nothing had happened, like I hadn't just been seen in a way I didn't know how to handle. I stepped back, nodding, finishing the service like I always did, but my hands didn't feel like mine anymore, my thoughts lagging behind everything I said and did, replaying that moment over and over. The way he looked at me, the way he asked that question, the way he didn't need my answer. I told myself it didn't matter, that he was just another customer, another powerful man passing through a world I served, but didn't belong to. That by tomorrow none of this would exist. It would just be another night, another shift, another set of lies that kept me moving forward. But as I cleared the table and walked away, I felt it again, that shift in the air, that quiet change I couldn't explain, like something had already started moving beyond my control, something I wouldn't see until it was too late to pretend it never happened. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if being seen was the thing that would save me, or the thing that would change everything. The shift should have ended at 11, but time moved differently that night, stretching in strange ways, every minute heavier than the last, and I kept replaying his voice in my head like a line I could not unhear, not loud, not threatening, just certain, like a door had quietly closed somewhere behind me. I finished clearing the last table, stacking glasses with careful precision, forcing my hands to stay steady, because control was the only thing I had left, and I needed to hold on to it. Even if it was just in small things like lining up silverware or folding napkins exactly the same way every time. Marco counted the register, barely looking at me, complaining about tips, about customers, about everything that did not matter, and I nodded at the right moments, said the right words, performed the version of myself that did not think too much, because thinking too much meant feeling, and feeling meant remembering, and remembering meant I might not be able to keep pretending. When I stepped outside, the rain had softened into a steady drizzle, the kind that soaked through your clothes without you noticing right away, the kind that made the city look quieter than it actually was, streetlights reflecting off wet pavement in long golden streaks that blurred when I blinked too hard. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and started walking toward the bus stop, counting my steps again, 1, 2, 3, a habit I picked up months ago when everything started to feel unpredictable, when I needed something to anchor me, something that did not change no matter what happened around me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I did not need to look to know who it was. The name alone enough to tighten something in my chest, enough to make my steps slow just a little, just enough to give fear a place to settle. I did not answer. I rarely did anymore, because every conversation followed the same pattern, the same apologies, the same promises, the same quiet shift that always came later, and I told myself I was managing it, that I had control, that I could handle it until I finished school, until I could leave on my own terms. The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes, and I climbed on, taking a seat near the back, watching the city pass by in blurred reflections, people moving through their lives like nothing was wrong, like nothing ever changed for them. And I wondered what that felt like, to exist without constantly calculating, without constantly adjusting, without constantly preparing for something you could not quite predict, but always expected. When I reached my stop, the street was nearly empty, just the distant sound of traffic and the low hum of a city that never fully slept, and I walked the remaining 2 blocks to my apartment building. Keys already in my hand, movements automatic, practiced, efficient. The hallway smelled faintly of cleaning solution and something older, something worn into the walls over years of people coming and going. And I moved quickly, not wanting to linger, not wanting to give myself time to think about anything except getting inside, locking the door, and making it through another night. But as I reached my door, something fell off, not obvious, not immediate, just a shift, subtle and quiet. The same kind of shift I felt earlier in the restaurant, the same kind of awareness that made everything else fade into the background. I hesitated, just for a second, listening, the silence pressing in, around me. And then I told myself I was overthinking, that I was tired, that nothing had changed, nothing ever really changed. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, flicking on the light. The familiar space grounding me for a moment, small, cluttered, safe in the way routines can feel safe even when they are not. And I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. I set my bag down, kicked off my shoes, and moved toward the kitchen, reaching for a glass of water, because simple things help. Simple things remind you that you are still here, that you are still in control of something. Even if it is just filling a glass and taking a sip. My phone buzzed again, more insistent this time, and I stared at it for a moment before flipping it face down on the counter, choosing silence over whatever waited on the other end, choosing not to engage, not tonight, not after everything that already felt too close to the surface. I leaned against the counter, closing my eyes for just a second, letting the quiet settle, letting the exhaustion catch up to me. And for a moment, just a moment, I almost believed I could make it through the night without anything else happening. But then there was a knock, soft, controlled, not the kind that demanded attention, not the kind that startled, just deliberate, measured, like whoever stood on the other side already knew I was there, already knew I would hear it. My eyes opened slowly, every instinct telling me to stay still, to wait, to pretend I was not home. But something about the knock felt different, not chaotic, not unpredictable, just certain. I walked to the door, each step careful, my hand hovering near the lock as I leaned slightly toward the peephole, my breath catching before I even looked. He stood there like he belonged in the hallway, like the building itself had adjusted to accommodate him. Dark suit still perfect despite the rain, posture relaxed but intentional, and even through the small lens, even through the distortion, I could feel it again, that same presence, that same quiet gravity that made everything else feel less important. Sebastian Hale did not knock again, did not move, just waited, as if time worked differently for him, as if he did not need to rush because the outcome was already decided. I should not have opened the door. Every part of me knew that. Every instinct built from months of surviving told me to keep it closed, to stay out of sight, to avoid anything I could not control. But my hand moved anyway, unlocking the door before my mind could catch up, pulling it open just enough to see him clearly, just enough to step into something I did not fully understand. He did not smile, did not greet me, his eyes moving briefly over my face like he was checking something, confirming something, and then settling, steady and unreadable. "You should not ignore your phone," he said, his voice calm, not accusing, just stating a fact. And I felt my chest tighten because he was not supposed to know that. He was not supposed to know anything about me beyond a table number and a name on a receipt. "How do you?" I started, but the question faded before it could form, because the answer was already there, already implied, already understood. He tilted his head, slightly, just enough to signal that the question did not matter, that there were more important things to focus on. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us in a way that felt heavier than words. "You said it was nothing," he continued, his gaze steady, not leaving mine. But nothing does not leave marks like that. And the way he said it made it clear he was not asking anymore. He was not looking for confirmation. He was simply acknowledging a truth I had tried to hide. I swallowed, forcing my shoulders to stay relaxed, forcing my voice to stay even. "It is handled," I said, repeating the line I had told myself over and over. The line that made everything manageable, the line that kept me moving forward. Something shifted in his expression then, not anger, not frustration, just a quiet kind of finality, like a decision settling into place. "No," he said softly, almost to himself. "It is not." And for the first time since I met him, I felt something unfamiliar, not fear exactly, but the sense that whatever came next was already in motion, already beyond anything I could stop or change. He stepped back slightly, giving me space, giving me the illusion of choice, but his eyes held mine just a second longer before he spoke. "Again, stay inside tonight," he said. The words simple, direct, not a command, not a request, just something that felt like both at the same time. And before I could respond, before I could ask anything else, he turned and walked down the hallway, his footsteps quiet, controlled, fading into the same silence he had stepped out of. I stood there for a long moment, the door still open, the hallway empty now, but the air still carrying that same shift, that same feeling that something had already begun, something I would not fully understand until it was too late to pretend it never happened. And as I slowly closed the door, locking it behind me, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was not the only one who knew the truth, and that changed everything. The door clicked shut and the sound echoed longer than it should have, like the apartment had changed shape around me, like something invisible had shifted its place inside my life and refused to leave. I stood there with my hand still on the lock, staring at nothing, listening to the quiet, because the quiet felt different now, heavier, like it was waiting for something I could not see. I told myself to breathe, to move, to go back to normal. Because normal was the only thing I understood, the only thing I could control, but the word did not fit the same way anymore. I walked to the window, pulling the curtain just enough to look down at the street. The rain still falling in thin, steady lines, cars passing slower than usual, headlights stretching across the pavement, and for a second I almost convinced myself that everything outside was exactly as it had always been. Then I saw it, a black car parked across the street, engine running, lights off, nothing unusual on its own, except it had not been there before, and something in the way it sat there, still and patient, made my stomach tighten in a way I could not explain. I let the curtain fall back into place, stepping away like distance could undo what I had already noticed, like ignoring it could make it disappear. My phone buzzed again on the counter, the screen lighting up the darkened kitchen, and this time I forced myself to look, because avoiding it no longer felt like control. It felt like surrender. The message was simple, just my name. Nothing else, no anger, no apology, just a reminder that I was still being watched in a different way, a way I understood too well, and for the first time that night, fear settled into something colder, something sharper. I turned the phone off completely, pressing the button until the screen went black, because silence was the only answer I had left to give, and I needed to hold on to that for as long as I could. I moved through the apartment slowly, checking the windows, checking the locks, small routines that used to calm me, used to make me feel prepared, but tonight they felt different, like I was not preparing for something I knew, but something I could not predict. I changed into an oversized sweater, the fabric soft against my skin, covering everything I did not want to see, everything I did not want to think about, and I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, replaying his words again. Not the question this time, but what came after, the certainty in his voice, the way he said it was not handled, like he had already stepped into a story I had been trying to keep small, contained, invisible. I should have been angry. I should have been cautious, because people like him did not step into your life without changing it, without taking something, without leaving something behind that you could not ignore. But what unsettled me the most was not fear. It was the strange, unfamiliar feeling that for the first time, someone had not accepted my answer. Someone had looked at the same lie I had told a dozen times and decided it was not enough. I lay back on the bed without turning on the light, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the rain, counting seconds instead of steps now. 1, 2, 3, trying to find a rhythm that would steady me, trying to find something predictable in a night that no longer felt safe in its routine. At some point, exhaustion pulled at me, heavier than the thoughts, heavier than the tension, and I let my eyes close, not because I felt safe, but because I did not have the energy to stay awake. I do not know how long I slept, but when I woke, it was still dark, the kind of dark that sits just before morning, quiet and expectant, and for a moment I forgot everything, the restaurant, the question, the knock at the door, all of it slipping away in that thin space between sleep and reality. Then my phone lit up again, vibrating against the nightstand, the sound sharp in the silence, pulling me back into everything I had tried to leave behind. I hesitated before turning it on, knowing that once I did, whatever waited there would be real, it would have weight. It would not be something I could ignore. When the screen came to life, the message waiting there was not from the number I expected, not from the one that had followed me for months, but from an unknown number, a single line that made my breath catch before I even understood why. "You are safe tonight." It read. Nothing more, no explanation, no signature, just certainty, the same quiet certainty I had heard earlier, the same tone that did not ask for belief, It assumed it. I sat up slowly, the words echoing in my mind, because safety was not something anyone had offered me in a long time. Not without conditions, not without expectations, and the simplicity of it felt almost unreal. I moved to the window again, pulling the curtain back just enough to look outside, and the car was still there, same position, same stillness, but now it did not feel like a threat. It felt like something else, something I did not have a word for yet. I watched it for a long moment, trying to understand what had changed, because something had, something subtle but undeniable, like a line had been drawn somewhere I could not see. The street remained quiet, no movement, no noise beyond the rain. But the tension I had carried for months felt different now, not gone, not erased, but shifted, like it had been moved out of my hands and into someone else's. I let the curtain fall again, stepping back into the room, my heart still steady, still aware, but no longer racing the same way, no longer bracing for something immediate. I did not know what he had done, or if he had done anything at all. I did not know what it meant to be safe tonight, or what tomorrow would look like, but I knew one thing with a clarity that settled deep in my chest. For the first time in a long time, the fear was not the only thing in the room with me, and that realization was more unsettling than anything else, because it meant something had already changed, and I was no longer the one deciding how the story moved forward. Morning came too quietly, like the city had decided to hold its breath, and I woke before my alarm with that same strange awareness sitting heavy in my chest. Not fear exactly, not relief either, something in between that I did not know how to name. The rain had stopped, leaving the air outside still and damp, the kind of morning where everything looked sharper, clearer, like the world had been rinsed clean overnight. And for a moment I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to decide if what I felt was real or just exhaustion catching up to me. My phone remained on the nightstand, dark and silent, and that alone felt different, because silence used to mean waiting, used to mean something was building, something I could not see yet, but knew would come. But this silence felt complete, like something had already happened, and I had simply not witnessed it. I sat up slowly, running a hand through my hair, trying to piece together the night, the knock, the message, the car outside, all of it blending together in a way that made it hard to tell where one moment ended and the next began. I stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to look down at the street, expecting to see the same car, the same quiet presence, but the space was empty now, just wet pavement and early morning light stretching across it, as if nothing had ever been there at all. Something in my chest tightened at that. Not panic, not disappointment, just a recognition that whatever had been set in motion did not need to stay visible to exist. I got ready for the day on autopilot, brushing my hair, pulling on a clean uniform, adjusting my sleeve the same way I always did, covering what needed to be covered, maintaining the routine that had kept everything contained for so long. But even as I did it, I felt the difference, subtle but undeniable. Like the routine belonged to a version of me that was already starting to shift. The bus ride felt shorter that morning, quieter, the usual noise of the city muted somehow. Or maybe it was just me, noticing different things, the way people looked at their phones, the way conversations started and stopped, the way everyone seemed to be reacting to something just out of reach. When I stepped into the restaurant, Marco was already there, pacing behind the counter, his usual complaints replaced by something else, something sharper, more focused, and as soon as he saw me, he stopped mid-step, his expression flickering between annoyance and something that looked almost like curiosity. "Did you hear about last night?" he asked before I could even set my bag down, his voice lower than usual, like he was sharing something he was not entirely sure he should be saying out loud. I shook my head, keeping my expression neutral, because reacting too quickly, too strongly, always led to more questions, and questions were something I had learned to avoid. He leaned in slightly, glancing around as if the empty restaurant might suddenly be listening. "Some guy," he said, pausing like he was choosing his words carefully. "The one who used to come in sometimes, the one who always caused problems. He left town." The way he said it made the words feel incomplete, like there was more to the story that he either did not know or did not want to say. I felt my pulse shift, just slightly, just enough to make me aware of it, and I focused on untying my apron, on something simple, Something controlled. People leave all the time, I said, keeping my voice even, dismissive, like it did not matter. Like I had no reason to connect it to anything else. Marco frowned, clearly unsatisfied. Yeah, but not like this, he muttered, shaking his head. No warning, no calls, just gone. And the weird part is, nobody is even asking about him. He added, his voice dropping even further. It is like everyone already knows not to. I tied the apron strings a little tighter than necessary, my fingers steady even as something inside me shifted again. That same quiet realization settling deeper. Because I did not need him to finish the story, I did not need details. I already understood enough. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine tasks, wiping tables, setting up for the lunch rush, refilling supplies. All the things I had done 100 times before, but everything felt slightly out of sync, like I was moving through a version of my life that had been subtly altered without my permission. Customers came and went, conversations filled the space, and I moved through it all with the same practiced ease, the same controlled movements, but my awareness stayed sharp, tracking every shift in tone, every glance, every moment that felt even slightly out of place. And then, just before noon, the door opened again, and I felt it before I saw him. That same quiet gravity, that same way the room adjusted without being told, conversations softening, movement slowing, attention shifting in ways people would never consciously admit. Sebastian Hale stepped inside like nothing had changed, like the world had not shifted overnight, like he had not said anything that lingered long after he left, and yet everything about his presence felt different now, not because he had changed, but because I had. I kept my eyes down for a moment, steadying myself, reminding myself that this was still my space, my routine, my life. But when I looked up, his gaze found mine immediately. Like it had been waiting, like it had known exactly where to look. He did not smile, did not signal, did not acknowledge anything beyond that brief moment of eye contact. But something passed between us anyway, something unspoken and undeniable, a recognition that did not need words to exist. I approached the table when it was time, tray balanced, posture controlled, every movement deliberate, and when I reached him, he looked at me the same way he had the night before, not at my uniform, not at the menu, not at anything that could be dismissed as surface level, but at me, like he was confirming something he had already decided. His eyes dropped briefly to my wrist, to the place where the marks had been hidden, still hidden now, and then lifted again, steady, unreadable, and for a second, just a second, I felt something unexpected, not fear, not anxiety, but something closer to calm. Good morning, I said, my voice steady, more steady than I expected it to be, and he nodded once. A small, controlled movement that felt more like acknowledgement than greeting. Good morning, Ava. He replied, using my name in a way that should have felt intrusive, but did not anymore. And as I stood there, waiting for his order, I realized something that settled into place with quiet certainty. Whatever had happened overnight, whatever had been set into motion, it had not been chaos, it had not been random, it had been deliberate, controlled, precise, just like everything about him. And for the first time since all of this began, I was not standing at the edge of something unknown, I was already inside it. There is a moment when everything looks the same on the surface, but underneath, nothing is where it used to be, and I felt that moment settle around me as I stood at his table, pen in hand, waiting for an order that suddenly felt like more than just food and drinks. Sebastian Hale did not rush, did not glance at the menu, did not acknowledge the subtle tension that had spread across the room the second he walked in. Because men like him did not react to the world reacted to them. I held my posture steady, shoulders relaxed, breath even, the version of myself I had perfected over years of learning how to move through spaces without drawing attention. But that version felt thinner now, like it could not fully contain everything I was becoming aware of. Coffee, he said finally, his voice low, measured, like every word had already been decided before he spoke it. Black. And I nodded, writing it down even though I would not forget, because the act of writing gave me something to do, something to anchor my hands to. I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me before I could take a full step. Ava, he said again, and the way he said my name made me pause, not because it was loud, but because it carried weight, intention, like it was meant to hold me in place for just a second longer. I looked back at him, meeting his eyes this time without hesitation, because avoiding it no longer felt like protection, it felt like denial. "You slept?" he asked, and the question caught me off guard, not because it was personal, but because it was simple, direct, something no one had asked me in a long time without expecting something in return. "Enough?" I answered, the truth sitting somewhere between exhaustion and something else I could not quite define, and he nodded once, like that was all he needed to know, like the answer confirmed something he had already anticipated. I brought his coffee a minute later, setting it down carefully, the steam rising between us, a thin barrier that felt almost symbolic, something soft and temporary between two things that were anything but. He did not reach for it immediately, his attention still on me, not intrusive, not invasive, just present, like he was taking in details that mattered for reasons I did not yet understand. "Things change quickly," he said after a moment, his fingers finally wrapping around the cup, the motion controlled, deliberate, sometimes faster than people are ready for, and I felt the words settle into place, not as a warning, not as advice, but as a statement of fact. "I am used to change," I replied, my voice steady, because I had learned to adapt, to adjust, to survive whatever came next without expecting stability, without expecting anything to stay the same for long. Something flickered in his expression then, not surprise exactly, but recognition, like he understood the meaning behind the words, like he knew they were not just about routine or work or anything surface level. "No," he said quietly, shaking his head just slightly. "You are used to enduring." And the difference between those two things hit me harder than I expected, because enduring meant surviving without control, without choice, and I realized in that moment that he was not just observing me. He was understanding something I had never put into words. I did not respond, because I did not know how to respond to that, how to correct something that was not wrong, and the silence stretched between us again, not uncomfortable, just real. Around us, the restaurant continued as if nothing had shifted, orders being called, plates moving, conversations rising and falling, but it all felt distant, like it existed on a different layer that I was no longer fully part of. "You are not worried," I said finally, the words coming out before I could stop them, because it was the one thing I could not ignore, the calm in him, the certainty, the absence of hesitation, and he looked at me for a long moment before answering, like he was deciding how much to say. "About what?" he asked, not dismissive, not evasive, just precise, and I hesitated, because saying it out loud would make it real in a different way, would connect the pieces in a way I could not undo. "About people leaving," I said carefully, choosing my words the same way I always did, measured, controlled, and his gaze held mine, steady, unreadable, but something in it shifted, something that felt almost like acknowledgement. "People leave every day," he said, his voice even. "The difference is whether it is their choice." And there it was, not an explanation, not a confession, but enough to confirm what I already knew without forcing me to say it outright. I felt my pulse steady instead of spike, which surprised me more than anything else, because fear had always been my first response, my instinct. But now it was something else, something quieter, something that felt more like awareness than panic. "And last night?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because if I was already inside this, if everything had already shifted, then pretending I did not see it felt pointless. He did not answer immediately, taking a slow sip of his coffee instead. The pause intentional, giving the moment space, giving the question weight. "Last night," he said finally, setting the cup down with the same controlled precision. Something that should have ended, and the simplicity of it made it feel final, complete, like there was nothing more to add, nothing more that needed to be said. I studied him for a second, trying to find something in his expression that would tell me more, something that would explain how someone could move through the world with that level of certainty, that level of control. But there was nothing obvious, nothing easy to read, just that same steady presence that had shifted everything without raising its voice. "You did not have to get involved," I said, because that part still mattered, still needed to be acknowledged, even if I did not fully understand it. His gaze sharpened slightly, not in anger, not in irritation, just in focus, Like the statement had landed exactly where it was meant to. I do not do things because I have to, he replied, his voice lower now, more deliberate. I do things because I decide to. And there it was again, that sense of choice, of control, of a world that moved according to his decisions rather than reacting to them. I exhaled slowly, absorbing that, because it was so different from the way I had been living, so different from the constant adjustments and calculations and compromises that had defined my days. And me? I asked, the question quiet but steady, because if I was part of that decision, I needed to understand what that meant, even if I was not sure I wanted the answer. He looked at me then, really looked, like he had from the very beginning, like he saw something beyond what I showed the rest of the world. And when he spoke, his voice did not rise, did not harden, did not soften either. It simply carried the same certainty that had been there from the start. You were never the problem, he said. And something in my chest shifted in a way I could not immediately process, because I had spent so long believing that everything I endured was something I had to manage, something I had to navigate carefully, something I had to keep contained. I stood there for a moment longer, the words settling, the realization forming. Slowly but undeniably, and for the first time since all of this began, I understood something clearly, something that changed the way everything fit together. It was not just that something had been removed from my life overnight. It was that someone had stepped into it and decided it should be different. And whether I was ready or not, whether I understood it or not, that decision had already been made. There is a strange kind of silence that comes after something ends, not loud, not obvious, but present in every space it used to fill, and I felt it follow me through the rest of the shift like a shadow that no longer had anything to attach itself to. I moved between tables, took orders, refilled glasses, all the motions automatic, practiced, but the tension that used to sit in the back of my mind, the constant awareness, the calculation, it was quieter, not gone, but no longer in control. Every time I passed table 12, I felt it again, that steady presence, not demanding, not pulling, just there, like a fixed point in a room where everything else moved around it. Sebastian did not try to stop me again, did not call my name, did not ask more questions, but I could feel the difference in the space between us, like something had already been decided and there was no need to push it further. When the lunch rush slowed and the room settled into that brief in-between where everything pauses before the next wave, I found myself standing still for a second longer than necessary, staring at nothing. Because for the first time in months, I was not anticipating the next problem. I was not bracing for the next shift in mood or tone or movement. And that absence felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting. You are distracted, Maria said as she passed by, her voice light, but her eyes sharp, noticing more than most people ever did. And I forced a small smile, shaking my head. Like it was nothing, like I had simply not slept enough, like there was not a quiet storm of realization settling into place inside me. Just tired. I replied, the easiest answer, the safest one, and she studied me for a second before nodding, accepting it for now, but I knew she would not forget. She was the kind of person who paid attention, the kind who noticed patterns, and I wondered briefly what she would see if she looked too closely at the way things had changed overnight. I stepped outside during my break, the air cooler now, the sky still heavy with clouds but no longer raining, the city moving at its usual pace, cars passing, people talking, everything appearing normal in a way that almost felt staged, like a scene set after something important had already happened. I leaned against the brick wall, folding my arms loosely, letting the cool air settle against my skin, and I realized something I had not allowed myself to think yet, something that had been sitting just beneath the surface since the moment he walked into the restaurant the night before. I was not afraid of what he had done. That thought should have unsettled me more than anything else, because fear had always been my instinct, my first response, the thing that kept me careful, that kept me aware, but now there was something else in its place, something quieter, something steadier, and I did not know if that made me stronger or more vulnerable. The door behind me opened, and I did not need to turn to know it was him. That same shift in the air, that same sense of space adjusting without effort. You should not stand out here alone, Sebastian said, his voice calm, not urgent, not concerned in the way people usually expressed concern, just certain, like it was a fact rather than a suggestion. I glanced over my shoulder, meeting his gaze briefly before looking back out at the street. Because eye contact with him felt different now, less like something to avoid and more like something I had not decided how to handle yet. I have been alone for a long time, I said, the words coming out softer than I expected, not defensive, just honest, and I felt his attention sharpen slightly behind me, like the honesty mattered more than anything else I could have said. That does not mean you should be, he replied, and the simplicity of it made it harder to dismiss, harder to brush off the way I usually would. I let out a small breath, watching it disappear into the cool air. You keep saying things like that, I said, turning slightly to face him now. Like it is. That's simple. And he stepped closer, not invading my space, just closing the distance enough that the conversation felt more direct, more intentional. It is simple, he said, his eyes steady on mine. It is just not easy. And there it was again, that distinction, that way of separating things into what they were versus how they felt, and I realized that was what made him different, not just the power, not just the presence, but the clarity, the way he saw things without the layers of fear or hesitation that I had built around everything. I studied him for a second, really looked this time, taking in the details I had avoided before, the way he held himself, the controlled stillness, the absence of wasted movement, and I understood something else then, something that settled into place just as quietly as everything else had. Nothing about him was accidental. Why me? I asked, the question direct, because if I was already inside this shift, if things were already changing, then I needed to understand the part one played in it. Even if I did not like the answer. He did not respond immediately, his gaze holding mine as if weighing the question, not whether to answer it, but how. Because you did not ask for help, he said finally, his voice low, measured, and you should have. And the words hit differently than I expected, not like an accusation, not like judgment, but like a statement of something he believed to be true. I frowned slightly, the response not what I had anticipated. That does not explain anything, I said, because it did not fully, not in a way that satisfied the part of me that still needed logic, still needed reason. It explains enough, he replied, and there was no arrogance in it, no dismissal, just certainty. The same certainty that had carried through everything he had said so far. I looked away for a second, processing that, because part of me wanted to argue, wanted to push back, wanted to hold on to the control I had always relied on. But another part of me, quieter but stronger, recognized the truth in what he said, recognized that I had been handling everything alone because I had believed I had no other choice. And now? I asked, my voice softer now, less guarded, because the question felt different, more important. He did not hesitate this time. Now you do, he said, and the weight of that settled between us, not heavy, not overwhelming, just present, like an option I had not considered before, like a door I had not realized was there. I stood there for a moment, the city moving around us, the sounds blending into the background, and for the first time, I was not calculating my next step, not preparing for what might go wrong, not bracing for something unpredictable. I was simply standing there, in a moment that felt steady, and that alone was enough to make me realize that whatever had changed, whatever had been set into motion, it was not just about what had been removed from my life. It was about what had been introduced into it, something I did not fully understand yet, but something I could not ignore anymore. There is a point where you realize you are no longer reacting to life. You are standing inside a moment that is choosing you instead, and I felt that realization settle in as I walked back into the restaurant, the door closing behind me with a quiet certainty that felt different from every other day before it. The noise returned, voices layered over each other, plates clinking, orders being called, but it all sounded distant now, like it belonged to a version of the world that I was slowly stepping away from without fully understanding how or why. I moved behind the counter, reaching for a glass, wiping it down out of habit more than necessity, my hands steady but my thoughts shifting, replaying everything he had said, not just the words, but the way he said them, like each sentence was placed exactly where it needed to be, like nothing was accidental. You okay? Maria asked again, this time closer, her eyes searching mine in a way that made it harder to deflect, and I nodded automatically, because that was what I always did. But the nod felt different, less convincing even to myself. Yeah, I said, forcing a small smile. Just thinking. And she raised an eyebrow slightly, like that answer was new, like thinking was not something she had seen me allow myself to do before. She did not push, just nodded once and moved on, but I could feel her attention linger for a second. Longer, like she was noticing the shift even if she could not name it. I glanced toward table 12 without meaning to, and he was still there, exactly where I left him, exactly as composed, exactly as controlled, like time did not affect him the way it did everyone else. And for a moment, I wondered what it felt like to move through the world like that, without hesitation, without second-guessing, without constantly adjusting to things outside your control. The afternoon passed in slow increments, each minute layering over the last, and I found myself more aware of everything. The way people spoke, the way they moved, the subtle tension that existed in spaces where power sat quietly instead of announcing itself. And I realized something I had not allowed myself to see before, that the world had always been like this, layered, shifting, controlled by forces most people never noticed. And I had simply been too focused on surviving to recognize it. When my shift ended, the sky had darkened again, clouds gathering in heavy formations that promised more rain, and I stepped outside with my bag over my shoulder, pausing for a second on the sidewalk, because going home no longer felt like the automatic next step it had always been. I stood there, watching the street, people passing by, cars moving, everything continuing as if nothing had changed, and yet everything inside me felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just altered in a way I could not reverse. You are waiting. His voice came from behind me, calm, certain, and I turned slowly, because I was no longer surprised by his presence, no longer startled by the way he appeared without effort, like he had always been part of the space even before I noticed him. Am I? I asked, tilting my head slightly, because the statement felt more accurate than anything I had said to myself all day. He stepped beside me, not too close, just enough to stand within the same frame of awareness, his gaze following mine out toward the street. You have not decided where to go next, he said. And again, it was not a question, it was an observation, one that landed with a clarity I could not deny. I let out a small breath, watching it fade into the cool air. I usually do not have to think about it, I admitted, because that was the truth. My life had been structured around routine, around predictability, around doing what needed to be done without questioning it too much. And now, he asked, his voice quieter this time, more focused, and I turned to look at him, really look, because the question mattered, more than I wanted to admit. Now it feels like I should, I said, the words slow, deliberate, because they carried weight, because they acknowledged something I had been avoiding. He studied me for a moment, his eyes steady, unreadable, but there was something there, something that felt almost like approval, not of me, but of the shift itself, like he recognized it as something important. Then do not go back to something just because it is familiar, he said, and the simplicity of it made it harder to ignore, harder to dismiss as something I could brush aside. I glanced down the street, toward the direction of my apartment, the path I had walked so many times it felt, like muscle memory, like something my body could follow even if my mind resisted, and I realized that for the first time, I was questioning it, not because I was afraid to go back, but because I was no longer sure it was the only option. You make it sound easy, I said, a small hint of disbelief in my voice, because stepping away from something familiar, even something painful, was never as simple as deciding to do it. It is not easy, he replied, his tone steady, unchanged. It is just necessary. And there it was again, that distinction, that clarity, that refusal to complicate something that felt overwhelming simply because it was unfamiliar. I looked at him for a second longer, something shifting into place inside me, something quiet but firm, like a decision forming without fully announcing itself. And if I do not know what comes next? I asked, because that was the part that still held me back, the uncertainty, the lack of control, the unknown. He did not hesitate this time, did not pause, did not weigh the answer. Then you find out, he said. And the way he said it made it sound less like a risk and more like a step, something forward, something possible. I stood there, the city moving around us, the sky darkening above, and I felt it again, that shift, But this time it was not something happening to me. It was something I was stepping into, something I was choosing, even if I did not fully understand it yet. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder, taking a slow breath, and for the first time since all of this began, I did not feel like I was waiting for something to happen. I felt like I was about to move, and that difference, subtle as it was, changed everything in a way I could not ignore anymore. There is a moment when choosing not to go back becomes louder than every reason telling you to stay, and I felt that moment settle into my chest as I stood there on the sidewalk, the city moving around me like nothing had shifted, like everything was still exactly where it had always been, but I knew it was not. I could feel it in the way my feet did not turn automatically toward home, in the way my hands did not reach for my phone, in the way my mind did not start calculating the next step. Based on fear, I stayed where I was for a second longer, letting the silence between us stretch, not uncomfortable, just real, because for the first time, I was not filling it with excuses or explanations. I was letting it exist. If I walk away from it, I said slowly, my voice steady but quieter than before, it does not just disappear, because that was the truth I had lived with, the truth that had kept me in place even when everything inside me wanted to leave. Sebastian did not look surprised, did not correct me, just listened, his attention fixed, deliberate, like every word mattered. No, he said after a moment. It does not disappear. And the confirmation settled into place without resistance, because I already knew it. I just needed to hear it without distortion, without fear shaping it into something else. I nodded slightly, absorbing that, because acknowledging reality without softening it was something I had avoided for a long time, something that required more strength than pretending things were manageable. Then what changes? I asked, the question direct. Because if I was standing here, if I was not moving back into the same pattern, then something had to be different, something had to shift in a way that mattered. He turned his head slightly, looking at me fully now, his gaze steady, unflinching. You do, he said, and the simplicity of it hit harder than any explanation could have, because it placed the shift exactly where it belonged, not in the situation, not in the past, but in me. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, the words settling deeper than I expected, because changing meant stepping into something unknown, something without guarantees, something that did not come with a clear outcome, and that had always been the part one avoided. And if I am not ready? I asked, because that was the part that still lingered, the hesitation, the uncertainty that came from years of learning to survive instead of choosing. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened slightly, not in pressure, not in expectation, just in focus. Then you decide if staying the same is better, he replied, and there was no judgment in it. No push, just a clear line drawn between two options, one I knew too well, and one I had not allowed myself to consider. I looked away for a moment, down the street, toward the direction I used to walk without thinking, and I realized that for the first time. It felt like a choice instead of a default, and that alone shifted something inside me. A car passed, headlights cutting through the dim light, the sound fading quickly, and I focused on that. On the way movement continued whether I acted or not, whether I chose or not, because the world did not pause for hesitation. You are not asking me to come with you, I said after a moment, the realization forming as I spoke, because he had not suggested it, had not directed me, had not tried to pull me into his world in a way that demanded anything from me. He shook his head slightly, the motion calm, controlled. No, he said. That would not mean anything. And I frowned just a little, because that answer felt incomplete, like there was more beneath it. Why? I asked, because understanding his reasoning felt important, more important than I expected. He held my gaze for a second longer before answering. Because it would be my decision, not yours. And there it was again, that focus on choice, on control, on the difference between being moved and choosing to move. And I realized that was the line he would not cross, the line that separated everything he had done from everything I had experienced before. I absorbed that slowly, the meaning settling into place, because it meant something I had not expected, something I had not prepared for. It meant that whatever came next would not be taken from me. It would be chosen, and that was unfamiliar in a way that felt both unsettling and steady at the same time. I adjusted the strap of my bag again, my fingers tightening slightly before relaxing, grounding myself in the moment, because this was it. This was the point where hesitation either held me in place or I stepped forward without knowing exactly where it would lead. I glanced at him once more, searching for something. Maybe reassurance, maybe confirmation, but his expression remained the same. Composed, certain, not pushing, not pulling, just present-like. He was waiting to see what I would do, not to influence it, but to witness it. I took a small step forward, not toward him, not away from him, just forward, a movement that felt simple but carried more weight than anything I had done in a long time. And I realized that was all it took, not a complete plan, not a full understanding, just a step in a direction that was not defined by fear. The air felt different as I moved. The city still the same around me, but my awareness shifting, my focus no longer fixed on what might go wrong, but on what I was choosing instead. This does not mean I understand any of this, I said, glancing back at him as I continued forward, because honesty still mattered, clarity still mattered, even if I did not have all the answers. A faint, almost imperceptible change touched his expression, not quite a smile, not quite anything I could name, but something that felt like acknowledgement. It does not have to, he replied, his voice steady behind me. It just has to be real. And that settled into place with a quiet certainty that matched everything else he had said, everything else he had done. I kept walking, not fast, not hesitant, just steady, each step grounding me more than the last, and for the first time, I was not counting them, not measuring them, not using them to control anything. I was simply moving. And as the distance between us stretched, I realized something that changed the way everything fit together. He had not followed me, had not called me back, had not tried to redirect me, and that absence of control was what made the moment real, what made the choice mine. The city opened up in front of me, lights flickering on as evening settled in, people moving in different directions, each one carrying their own decisions, their own paths, and for the first time, I did not feel like I was stuck in one that had already been decided for me. I did not know where I was going yet. I did not know what the next step would look like, but I knew one thing with a clarity that felt new and undeniable. I was no longer standing still, and that was enough to change everything. I did not look back, not because I was sure, but because I knew if I did, I might stop, and stopping felt too close to everything I had just stepped away from. The city stretched in front of me in long lines of light and shadow, sidewalks still damp from earlier rain, the air carrying that quiet hum that only exists when something has already shifted but the world has not caught up yet. I walked without a destination at first, just letting my feet move, letting the rhythm of it settle into something steady, something real, because for the first time in a long time, I was not walking to escape something. I was walking towards something I had not defined yet. My phone stayed silent in my bag, and that silence felt different now. Not heavy, not waiting, just empty in a way that left space for something else. I passed storefronts with lights flickering on, people laughing inside, conversations spilling out onto the street. Normal life continuing in ways that felt distant but not unreachable. And I realized that for so long, I had existed just outside of that, close enough to see it, not close enough to feel part of it. I slowed near a small cafe on the corner, the warm light inside catching my attention, something about the softness of it, the simplicity, and I hesitated for just a second before pushing the door open, the bell above it chiming quietly as I stepped inside. The air was warmer, filled with the smell of coffee and something sweet, something familiar, and I stood there for a moment, adjusting to the change, because stepping into a place without calculating who might be there, without preparing for what might happen, felt unfamiliar in a way I had not expected. "What can I get for you?" the barista asked, her voice casual, unguarded, and I blinked slightly, realizing I had not even thought that far ahead, had not planned what I would say, what I would order, because I was not used to making choices without weighing consequences. "Just coffee," I said after a second, the words simple, almost surprising in their ease, and she nodded, turning away to prepare it without another thought, without another question, and that, more than anything, felt grounding. I took the cup when she handed it to me, the warmth seeping into my hands, something small but steady, and I moved to a table near the window, sitting down slowly, taking in the space, the quiet conversations, the absence of tension that I had grown so used to carrying. I watched the street through the glass, people passing by, each one moving with purpose or without it, each one existing in their own moment. And I realized that for the first time, I was not watching for danger, not scanning for signs, not anticipating something to break the calm. I took a sip of the coffee. The taste simple, nothing special, but it grounded me in a way that felt new, like I was present in a moment instead of bracing for the next one. And then, without warning, a thought settled into place, quiet but undeniable. What happens now? I stared at the reflection in the window, my own face looking back at me, softer somehow, not because anything had been fixed, not because everything was suddenly easy, but because something had shifted inside me, something that had been held tight for too long was no longer pulling the same way. I thought about my apartment, the space I had called safe because it was predictable, because it was mine, but now it felt different in my mind, not unsafe, not dangerous, just not the same place it had been before. I thought about the routines I had built, the patterns I had followed, the ways I had learned to move through each day without questioning too much, and I realized that stepping away from something did not automatically tell you where to go next. It just left you with space, and space could be just as overwhelming as anything else. My fingers tightened slightly around the cup, the warmth grounding me again, reminding me that I was here, in this moment, not in the past, not in what had already ended. The bell above the door chimed again as someone entered, and I glanced up instinctively, my awareness still sharp even as my thoughts slowed. And for a second, my breath caught, not from fear, not from tension, but from recognition. He did not belong in a place like this, not because he could not be there, but because everything about him shifted the space around him, even in a quiet cafe on a corner street. Sebastian Hale stepped inside like he had always known where I would be, like this was not coincidence, not chance, but something expected, something already accounted for. He did not look around, did not hesitate, his gaze finding mine almost immediately, and I felt that same quiet awareness settle again. Not overwhelming, not intrusive, just present. He walked over without urgency, without drawing attention, and stopped across from my table, his presence filling the space in a way that did not disrupt it, just redefined it. You chose not to go back, he said, his voice low, even. And I nodded slightly, because there was no point in denying it, no point in pretending otherwise. I did. I replied, my voice steady, more certain than I expected it to be, and something in his expression shifted, not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but I saw it. I felt it. That same quiet acknowledgement. He did not sit immediately, did not assume, just waited, giving me the space to decide. And I gestured slightly toward the chair across from me, the movement small but intentional, because this, too, was a choice. He sat then, controlled, deliberate, his attention still on me, not intense, not demanding, just focused. And now, he asked, the same question I had been asking myself, but different coming from him, because it carried no uncertainty, no hesitation, just expectation. That there would be an answer, even if it was not clear yet. I looked down at the coffee for a second, the surface still, reflecting the light above, and I realized that I did not have a full answer, not yet, but I had something small, something real. Now I figure it out, I said, lifting my gaze to meet his, and for the first time, the words did not feel like a question, they felt like a direction. He studied me for a moment, that same steady gaze, and then nodded once, like that was enough, like that was exactly what he expected. Good, he said simply, and the words settled into place without pressure, without expectation beyond what I had already chosen. I leaned back slightly, the chair steady beneath me, the cafe quiet around us, and I realized that this moment, simple as it was, carried more weight than anything else had, because it was not built on fear, not driven by reaction. It was built on choice, on awareness, on something that was finally mine to define. And as I sat there, across from a man who moved the world with decisions I did not fully understand, I realized something that felt both grounding and unsettling at the same time. This was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something I had not yet learned how to navigate, and for the first time, I was not just surviving it, I was stepping into it. There is a difference between sitting across from someone and being seen by them. and I felt that difference settle deeper as the silence between us stretched, not empty, not awkward, just filled with something I was still learning how to understand. The cafe moved around us, quiet conversations, soft music, the steady rhythm of a place that existed outside of whatever had shifted in my life. And yet it felt like everything inside this moment was more focused, more deliberate, like time had narrowed down to just this table, this conversation, this decision I had already made without fully realizing it. I wrapped my hands around the cup again, letting the warmth ground me, because grounding myself in small things had always been how I stayed steady. But now it felt different, less like survival, more like awareness. You knew I would not go back, I said after a moment, my voice calm, not accusing, just stating something that had been sitting quietly in my mind since he walked in. Sebastian did not deny it, did not deflect, his gaze steady on mine as he responded. I knew you would have a choice. And the distinction mattered. I could feel it. The difference between prediction and control, between expecting something and forcing it. I tilted my head slightly, considering that, because it meant he had not moved me. He had simply removed something and left the rest up to me. And that realization carried more weight than anything else. You are very certain about things, I said, not as a challenge, just an observation, because everything about him moved with that same quiet certainty, like hesitation did not exist in the way it did for most people. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed but intentional, every movement measured. I do not waste time being uncertain about things that are clear, he replied. And I let that settle, because to him, things had been clear from the beginning in a way they had not been for me. I looked down at the coffee again, the surface no longer still, small ripples forming as I shifted my grip, and I realized that clarity was something I had avoided, something I had blurred intentionally, because seeing things clearly meant making decisions I was not ready to make. And me? I asked, lifting my gaze again. Was I clear to you? Because that question mattered more than I expected, more than I wanted to admit. He did not answer immediately, his eyes studying me in that same focused way, not invasive, not uncomfortable, just thorough, like he was considering the weight of the question instead of rushing to respond. Yes, he said finally, and the simplicity of it made it harder to process. Because I did not feel clear, I felt complicated, layered, uncertain. How? I asked, because I needed to understand what he saw that I had not allowed myself to see. His expression did not shift, but his voice lowered slightly, more deliberate. Because you stayed when you should have left, he said. And you left the moment you understood you could. And the words hit something inside me with a quiet force, because they were true in a way I had not framed for myself before, not as weakness, not as failure, but as a pattern, a moment of awareness followed by action. I exhaled slowly, leaning back in my chair, letting that settle, because it changed the way I saw everything, not as something I had been trapped in, but something I had not yet recognized I could step out of. So you think I am, what, decisive? I asked, a small hint of uncertainty slipping through, because I was still trying to understand how he categorized things, how he saw the world in ways that felt so different from my own. I think you are capable, he replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no embellishment, just a statement that felt heavier than it should have, because it was not something I had been told often, not in a way that carried belief behind it. I looked at him for a second longer, searching for something in his expression that would soften it, that would make it feel less absolute. But there was nothing there except that same steady certainty. And what does that mean now? I asked, because capability meant nothing without direction, without understanding what to do with it. He reached for his coffee then, taking a slow sip before answering, the pause intentional, giving the question space. It means what happens next is yours, he said, setting the cup back down with that same controlled precision. Not something you endure, not something you wait for, something you choose. And I felt the words settle deeper than anything else he had said so far, because they shifted the weight of everything, placed it directly in my hands in a way that was both freeing and overwhelming. I glanced toward the window again, the street outside still moving, people passing by, each one following their own path, their own decisions, and for the first time, I saw it differently, not as something separate from me, but as something I was part of, something I could step into without fear defining every move. You make it sound like I can just start over, I said. The thought still unfamiliar, still something I had not fully allowed myself to consider. You already did, he replied, and I froze for a second, because the truth of that was immediate, undeniable. I had already stepped away, already chosen something different, even if I did not have a full plan yet. I let out a small breath, something in my chest loosening just slightly, because recognizing that meant I was not at the beginning. I was already in motion. And you? I asked after a moment, because there was still something I did not understand, something I had not asked yet. Where do you fit into that? Because he had stepped into my life in a way that could not be ignored, in a way that had already changed everything. He held my gaze for a second longer, the silence stretching just enough to make the answer feel deliberate when it came. I do not, he said simply, and I frowned slightly, because that answer felt incomplete, like there was more behind it. Then why are you here? I asked, because if he did not fit into what came next, then his presence did not make sense, not in the way everything else had. Something shifted in his expression then, subtle but real, like the question had reached something deeper than the others, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that same quiet certainty, but with something else layered beneath it, something I could not immediately name. Because you are, he said, and the words landed in a way that did not need further explanation, because I understood what he meant, not logically, not completely, but enough to feel the weight of it. I sat there for a moment, the cafe quiet around us, the world continuing outside the window, and I realized that this was not something simple, not something easy to define or categorize. It was something unfolding, something that did not follow the patterns I was used to, something that required me to stay present instead of trying to predict it. I took another sip of my coffee, the warmth steady, grounding, and for the first time, I did not feel like I needed all the answers. I did not feel like I needed to control what came next. I just needed to recognize that it was mine to choose. And as I looked at him again, really looked, I understood something that shifted the way everything fit together. He had not taken control of my life. He had removed the illusion that I did not have any, and that difference, quiet as it was, changed everything in a way I could not ignore anymore. There is a moment when understanding becomes heavier than confusion, because once you see something clearly, you cannot return to the version of yourself that did not. And I felt that weight settle into me as I sat there, the warmth of the coffee fading in my hands while everything he had said rearranged itself into something I could not ignore. The cafe had not changed. The quiet conversation still moved around us, the soft hum of machines, the low clink of cups, but I felt like I was sitting in a different version of it now, one where every detail stood out sharper, more defined, like I had stepped into focus instead of hiding in the background. I watched him for a moment, really watched, not with caution, not with hesitation, but with intent, because if this was real, if this shift was real, then I needed to stop observing from a distance and start understanding what stood in front of me. You do not belong in places like this, I said, the words quiet but direct, not judgment, just observation, because everything about him felt out of place in a small corner cafe, not because he could not be there, but because his presence reshaped the space around him. He did not react, did not take offense, his expression unchanged as he replied, I belong wherever I decide to be. And the answer carried that same controlled certainty, that same refusal to let environment define him. And I realized that was the difference. He did not adapt to spaces, he redefined them. I leaned back slightly, considering that, because it was so far from how I had been living, constantly adjusting, constantly shaping myself to fit into whatever space I was in. And you think I can do that too? I asked, the question more honest than I intended, because it revealed something I had not fully admitted yet. That part of me wanted to believe it was possible. He met my gaze without hesitation. I think you already started, he said. And again, the simplicity of it made it harder to argue, harder to dismiss. I glanced down at my hands, still wrapped around the cup, the warmth almost gone now. But I did not move to refill it, did not break the moment, because something important was unfolding, something I needed to stay present for. It does not feel like control, I admitted, my voice quieter, because that was the truth. It felt uncertain, unfamiliar, like stepping on a ground I had not tested yet. Control is not always loud, he replied, his voice steady. Sometimes it is just the absence of fear deciding for you. And that landed deeper than anything else, because fear had been the thing shaping my choices for so long. The invisible force behind every decision, every hesitation, every compromise. I let that settle, because it reframed everything, not as gaining something new, but as removing something that had always been there. And what happens when fear comes back? I asked, because I knew it would. I knew it was not something that disappeared completely, not overnight, not without warning. He did not look away, did not soften the answer. Then you decide if it matters, he said. And I felt the clarity of that in a way that left no room for excuses, no space to hide behind uncertainty. I exhaled slowly, leaning back further in my chair, my eyes drifting toward the window again. The city still moving, still unchanged in appearance, but everything about how I saw it had shifted. You talk like everything is simple, I said, not accusing, just trying to understand the way he processed the world. It is simple, he replied. People just make it complicated because they are afraid of the answer. And I could not argue with that, not honestly, because I had done the same thing, over and over, complicating things that were clear because the clarity required action. I looked back at him, something settling into place inside me, not fully formed, but strong enough to feel, like a foundation being laid quietly beneath everything else. You said you do not fit into what comes next, I said, bringing the conversation back to the one piece that still did not fully align. But you are still here, and that contradiction mattered, because it meant something I had not fully understood yet. He held my gaze, the silence stretching for a second before he answered. Being here and belonging are not the same thing, he said, and the distinction was subtle but important, like everything else he had said, layered with meaning that did not need to be explained directly. I frowned slightly, not because I disagreed, but because I was still working through what that meant for me, for him, for whatever this was becoming. Then why stay? I asked, because if he did not belong in what came next, then his presence still needed a reason, still needed context. Something shifted in his expression again, small, controlled, but there, like the question had reached something he did not answer as easily as the others. Because sometimes, he said slowly, his voice quieter now, more deliberate, you make sure something starts before you step back. And the words settled into place with a weight that felt different from everything else. Because they implied an ending as much as a beginning, a boundary as much as a presence. I absorbed that, the meaning unfolding slowly, because it suggested that this moment, this connection, had limits, had an edge I had not yet reached but would eventually have to face. So you are not staying, I said, not as a question, but as a realization forming in real time, and he did not correct me, did not soften it, just held my gaze with that same steady certainty. That depends, he replied, and for the first time, there was something different in his tone, not uncertainty, but something closer to openness, like the answer was not fixed yet, like it was not entirely his to decide. I felt my chest tighten slightly at that, not from fear, but from awareness, because it meant that whatever this was, whatever had begun, was not something he controlled alone, not something he could define without me. I looked down at the table, at the faint ring left by my cup, at the small details that grounded the moment, and I realized something that shifted everything once again. This was no longer just about what he had done, or what I had stepped away from. It was about what I was stepping into, something that required me to be present, to choose, to define it alongside him. I lifted my gaze again, meeting his eyes with a steadiness I had not felt before, not because I had all the answers, but because I understood that I did not need them yet. Then maybe it does not depend on you, I said quietly, and the words carried a weight that surprised even me, because they acknowledged something new, something that had not existed before, a balance, a shift in power that was not about control, but about choice. He did not respond immediately, but I saw it, that subtle change, that recognition, like he understood exactly what I meant, exactly what had shifted, and for the first time, I realized that whatever this was, it was no longer something happening to me. It was something I was shaping, and that realization changed everything in a way I could not undo. There is a moment when the balance shifts so quietly you almost miss it, not because it is small, but because it does not demand attention. It simply exists, And I felt that shift settle between us as the silence stretched again, no longer uncertain, no longer something to fill, but something that held weight on its own. I did not look away this time, did not soften the moment, because I understood now that looking away was a choice. And I was done choosing that. Sebastian remained still across from me, his gaze steady, not pressing, not retreating, just present in a way that felt different from everything else I had known. Because it did not take, it did not demand, it simply waited. The cafe continued around us, the world moving as it always had. But the space at this table felt separate, contained, like it had become its own axis, something quiet but central. You are not used to that, he said after a moment, his voice low, even, and I knew he was not talking about the cafe, or the conversation. He was talking about the shift, the way I had met his words without stepping back, without retreating into the version of myself that stayed quiet. No, I said, and there was no need to explain, because the honesty sat plainly in the space between us. I am not. And admitting it did not feel like weakness, it felt like clarity, something I had avoided for too long. He nodded once, like that was enough, like acknowledgement was all that was needed, and I realized that was another difference. He did not require justification, did not expect explanation. He simply recognized what was there. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, the movement small but deliberate, because I was no longer reacting, I was engaging, and that distinction mattered. You said this depends, I said, my voice steady. So let it depend on something real. And as I spoke, I realized I was no longer asking for answers. I was defining terms, something I had not done before. His eyes did not leave mine, but something in them sharpened, not in tension, but in attention, like the conversation had reached a point where something meaningful was being established. Then say it, he replied. And the simplicity of that felt heavier than any long explanation, because it placed the next step entirely in my hands. I held his gaze for a second longer, not searching, not hesitating, just making sure I understood what I was about to say, because once spoken, it would exist in a way that could not be undone. You do not decide what I become, I said quietly, the words clear, measured, not defensive, just defined. And I do not disappear just because you stepped in. And as the sentence settled, I felt something inside me align, something steady, something grounded. The silence that followed was different, not uncertain, not tense, just full, like the words had created something that needed a moment to exist on its own. Sebastian did not react immediately, and that mattered more than if he had, because it meant he was considering, not dismissing, not overriding. Good, he said finally, his voice unchanged, but something beneath it shifted, something that felt almost like approval, not of me, but of the boundary itself. I exhaled slowly, not realizing I had been holding that breath, because saying it had mattered more than I expected. It had defined something that had not been clear before, not just to him, but to me. And you, I added after a moment, because the balance had to be real, had to exist on both sides. Do not get to step back whenever it is convenient. And the words came easier this time, not forced, not hesitant, just true, because if this was something that existed between us, then it could not be one-sided. It could not be controlled by only one person. His expression shifted then, subtly, not in disagreement, not in resistance, but in recognition, like he understood exactly what I was doing, exactly what I was establishing. No, he said, and the answer was simple, but it carried weight, because it was not dismissive, it was agreement, and that changed the shape of everything. I leaned back slightly, the chair steady beneath me, the moment settling into something that felt defined in a way I had not experienced before, because it was not built on reaction, it was built on choice, on clarity, on something that existed because I allowed it to. Outside the window, the sky had darkened further, the city lights becoming more prominent, reflections stretching across the glass, and I realized how much time had passed without me noticing, because I had been present in a way I was not used to, fully aware of each moment instead of waiting for it to end. So what happens now? I asked, not because I was unsure, but because the question itself felt different now, less about seeking direction, more about acknowledging that there was one. He did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting briefly toward the window before returning to me, like he was considering not just the question, but the moment itself. Now, he said slowly, we see what you do with it. And the phrasing mattered, not what we do, not what happens, but what I do, placing the focus exactly where it belonged. I nodded slightly, accepting that, because it aligned with everything else, everything that had shifted, everything that had been set into motion. I stood then, the movement natural, not abrupt, because sitting there had reached its end. The moment had completed itself in a way that did not need to be forced further. He did not stop me, did not question it, just watched, his attention steady, like he understood that this was part of it too, part of the choice, part of the movement. Forward, I picked up my bag, adjusting the strap over my shoulder, grounding myself in the physical action, because even now, even with everything that had changed, I still needed those small anchors, those points of reality that kept everything steady. I glanced at him one more time, not searching for anything, not asking anything, just acknowledging the presence that had shifted everything without taking it away. This is not yours to control, I said, the words quiet but clear, not as a challenge, not as a warning, just as a statement of what now existed between us. He held my gaze, and for a second, just a second, something in his expression softened, not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but I saw it. I felt it. That same recognition that had been building from the beginning. I know, he said, and the simplicity of it confirmed everything, because it meant he understood the line, understood the balance, understood that whatever this was, it existed because I allowed it to. I turned then, walking toward the door, the bell above it chiming softly as I stepped back out into the evening. The air cooler now, the city alive in that quiet, steady way that felt different from before, not because it had changed, but because I had. And as I moved forward, not looking back this time, not hesitating, I understood something that settled into place with quiet certainty. This was no longer about what had been taken away from my life. It was about what I was building in its place, something that was mine, something that would not be decided for me again. There is a quiet kind of power in walking away without losing yourself, and I felt that settle into every step I took as the door closed behind me. The sound soft but final in a way that did not echo, did not pull me back, just marked the moment for what it was. The evening air wrapped around me, cooler now, carrying the distant hum of the city that never truly stopped, and for the first time, I was not listening for what might break the calm. I was simply aware of it, present in a way that did not feel like survival. I moved down the sidewalk at a steady pace, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, and that certainty was unfamiliar enough to feel new, but not fragile, not something that would disappear the second I questioned it. The lights above flickered on one by one, storefronts glowing, reflections stretching across glass and pavement, and I caught my own reflection in a window as I passed, my expression softer, not because everything had been resolved, but because something inside me had shifted into alignment. I stopped for a second, just long enough to look, really look, because I had spent so long avoiding that, avoiding seeing myself clearly, and now it felt different, like I was not looking for flaws, not looking for signs of what needed to be hidden, but simply acknowledging what was there. My phone remained silent in my bag, and that silence no longer felt like something waiting to be broken. It felt like space, like something open instead of something looming. I reached my building without realizing how far I had walked, the familiar structure standing exactly where it always had, unchanged, predictable, and for a moment I just stood there, looking at it, because this place had been my constant, my routine, my version of safety, and now it felt like something I had to choose again instead of something I automatically returned to. I stepped inside, the hallway the same as always, quiet, worn, carrying the faint echo of other lives moving through it, and I moved toward my door without counting steps, without bracing, just walking, just existing in the moment without trying to control it. The key turned easily in the lock, the click softer than I remembered, or maybe I was just hearing it differently now, and when I stepped inside, the space greeted me the same way it always had, familiar, contained, but no longer defining me in the way it used to. I set my bag down slowly, taking in the room, the small details, the things I had arranged to create a sense of order, and I realized that none of it felt like a cage anymore. It felt like a starting point, something I could shape instead of something I was confined within. I walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to look out at the street, the city lights steady, the movement constant. And I understood something with a clarity that did not need to be forced. Nothing outside had changed, but everything inside me had. And that was enough to make the world feel different. I leaned my hand against the glass, the cool surface grounding me. And for a moment, I let the silence settle, not heavy, not empty, just present, like it was no longer something to fill, but something to exist within. My thoughts did not race the way they used to, did not jump ahead to what could go wrong, did not try to predict the next shift. They simply moved at their own pace, steady, clear, and I realized that was the difference. I was no longer reacting. I was choosing. I stepped back from the window, moving through the apartment, with a sense of awareness that had not been there before, noticing the small things, the way the light fell across the floor, the way the air felt still but not suffocating, the way everything seemed to wait, not for something to happen, but for me to decide what came next. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the same place I had sat so many times before, but this time the weight felt different, not pressing down, not holding me in place, just grounding me, anchoring me in the moment. I thought about everything that had happened, not in fragments, not in flashes of reaction, but as a whole, a sequence of choices, of moments that had led me here, and I realized that none of it had been accidental, not the question, not the silence, not the decision to walk away, not even the conversation that followed. It had all been part of something unfolding, something I had stepped into without fully understanding, but something I was now shaping in a way I had never done before. I lay back slowly, staring up at the ceiling, the quiet wrapping around me in a way that felt steady instead of overwhelming. And for the first time in a long time, I did not feel the need to fill it with noise, with distraction, with anything that would keep me from thinking. I let the moment exist, let the awareness settle, and I understood something that felt both simple and profound. I was no longer waiting for someone to ask me what had happened, no longer waiting for someone to see what I had tried to hide. I had already been seen, and more importantly, I had seen myself. My phone buzzed then, a soft vibration against the surface of the table, and I turned my head slightly, looking at it without urgency, without that immediate tightening in my chest, because whatever it was, it no longer held the same weight over me. I reached for it slowly, turning it over, the screen lighting up with a single message, no name, no explanation, just words that felt familiar in a way that did not need context. You did not go back. It read, simple, direct, and I stared at it for a second before a small, almost imperceptible shift settled into place inside me. Not surprise, not confusion, just recognition. I did not respond immediately, did not feel the need to, because this was not about answering, not about confirming. It was about understanding what had already happened. I set the phone down again, the screen going dark, and I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the silence return, letting the stillness hold its place. And as I lay there, in a space that no longer felt like something I had to escape, I realized something that carried through everything, through every moment, through every shift, through every decision I had made. He had not saved me. He had not changed my life. He had simply removed the one thing that made me believe I could not change it myself. And that difference, quiet as it was the reason everything felt possible now.